Welcome to Behind the Neon Lights, Understanding Personal Injury Law in Las Vegas and Beyond.
Welcome to Behind the Neon Lights, Understanding Personal Injury Law in Las Vegas and Beyond with C. Jared Clark, owner and founder of Clark Law Group. They specialize in auto collisions, motorcycle crashes, workplace accidents, and personal injury law, and they're dedicated to helping clients every step of the way. My name is John Clements, and today's episode is Tangled Up, Navigating the Complexities of Multi-Vehicle Car Wrecks. So Jared, welcome to the show.
Good afternoon, John. How you doing today?
I'm doing great, man. How are you?
Good. It's been a good day so far.
Cool. So let's get started. Let's just talk for a minute. I kind of like set the table here. What makes multi-vehicle car wrecks more complex than like a single car accident?
Well, there's a lot of different influences that, are responsible for making multi-vehicle accidents more complex. The main one being is there's a lot of different parties involved, right? And oftentimes, even when there's just two parties involved, humans could look at the same incident and have a completely different version of what just transpired, and sometimes it's not necessarily that they're lying, right? Perception, there's a lot of things that influence that. But, when you have a 3 or 4 vehicle accident, who hit who first? How many points of impacts did a particular driver feel, right? And if they were injured, what impact caused what injuries? So it's a lot of these kind of challenging hurdles that are presented when there's a lot of vehicles involved.
Yeah, so let's dive into that for a minute, because how do you actually determine fault in a multi-vehicle crash?
It's through statements from the drivers. Hopefully there's some independent witnesses who aren't involved in any of the vehicles that were involved in the crash, right? Usually that testimony or those statements are a little bit more objective or have the ability to be a little bit more objective, right? If there's any surveillance that captured the incident, we're starting to see a few more dash cams, not as many as I would like to see on the road, but I can tell you I'm seeing more now than I saw 2 and 3 years ago. So these are all pieces of information that will help kind of get down to the truth of exactly what happened. Some of the EDR data or the black box data in the vehicles could also be an asset.
I see. And are there any challenges along with that would come with identifying liability?
Yes. So Nevada is what we call a comparative negligence state, where you could still be partially responsible or partially at fault for an auto accident, but still seek a recovery. And in Nevada, you have to be 50% or less, where you could still seek a settlement or pursue your case. However, the award is going to be reduced, or the settlement is going to be reduced based upon what you were at fault for. So when you have so many different vehicles involved, there's always a argument usually to be made that, someone wasn't using due care. You should have stopped earlier, or maybe one of the parties overcorrected, right, and trying to avoid an incident, and they winded up hitting another car that causes domino effect. So the arguments just become a lot more creative and a lot more gray area when it comes down to, who's at fault, one, and for how much. Right? Someone could be 5 or 10% at fault. Someone could be 50% at fault. Someone could be 100% at fault. So when you have so many different statements, oftentimes that muddies the water for that to happen.
Okay, so it sounds to me, and correct me where I'm wrong, it sounds to me like if you have a multi-vehicle crash in Nevada, you might have a scenario where 2 or 3 or more drivers might all be paying out to different insurance companies or different fees. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah,
Okay.
each insurance company is going to be responsible for, however much fault their driver was responsible for. So, you can have 2 or 3, a State Farm, a Geico, a Liberty Mutual, and they're all paying out their respective shares. Or they're denying, right? And now we need to go to
Yeah.
litigation, and we're going to allow the litigation process to determine who's responsible for what.
So that could get really complicated really fast.
It can, and in most places you have something called, it's a theory of liability, joint and several liability. And that's where, even if you're just a percentage at fault, the law allows for you to be deemed 100% at fault to pay out. And then sometimes you can seek indemnification from another party if you believe they were at fault, or contribution to help pay for things. But that's a theory of liability that really puts a lot of risk on the at fault drivers. when they're just
Got it.
pointing the finger at each other.
Yeah, sure. And so with that and the complexities you just mentioned, that's going to make gathering evidence like super critical. So can you just walk us through the process of how you gather evidence in a multi-vehicle accident?
Yeah, it's kind of similar. The first thing you're certainly going to do, I think, law enforcement, their credibility goes a long way. So to ensure that they're coming to conduct a full investigation, right? They're speaking to all the drivers separately. They're getting witness statements. These are things that we're going to need later on, especially if witnesses start to disappear. That's probably the most important component when it comes to trying to preserve exactly what happened, assuming there's no video surveillance that captures everything.
Right. And then kind of follow-up question,
Mhm.
let's say you've got your evidence, you've worked with law enforcement, and then all the parties are now represented by attorneys. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I don't know if it's a good or bad thing, right? I could tell you it creates additional hurdles. A lot of people don't like attorneys naturally, so when you got three, four, five lawyers involved, right? You can imagine things get a little contentious at times, right? Because everybody's advocating their client's interests to the best of their ability, right, and zealously. So things definitely get more confusing, and sometimes lost in translation when it comes to trying to get some information from that particular party. Obviously, when a lawyer is involved, you're not allowed to talk to that party. When a lawyer is not involved, we have the ability, we could talk to the party. There's nothing that prevents that. But once a lawyer gets involved, we have to communicate with their lawyer. So, that often takes a lot of the kind of just direct one on one communication of us trying to gather additional information to see exactly what happened.
Okay, so now I'm starting to understand why I think you mentioned in the previous episode why these things can linger on for 6 months, a year, 2 years because of these complications.
Yes. These type of cases, they have the propensity, high likelihood to go ahead and linger on for a few years because you got people pointing the finger at other insurance companies. Sometimes you got people being less than honest, right? An insurance company isn't recognizing that. So, and that's what court is for, right? It's when our clients and us, the insurance company or the adjuster, has reached an impasse, and that's where clients are allowed to have their day in court to get their justice.
And I do want to talk about that as well. I want to talk about insurance companies and their role in all of this. So, how do they approach multi vehicle car wreck claims, and how does that kind of impact the work that you do?
Yeah. So another challenging component to these type of scenarios, right? Insurance companies, they always have what's called a liability policy limit. Okay. And that's where they have a contract with their driver where they're responsible to pay up to a certain amount, depending on what our client's damages are. So that might be a $25,000 policy limit per person. It might be a $50,000 policy limit per person. And that's what they're entitled to pay out if they believe that our client's damages warrant that, right? Either equal to it or in excess of that. And if it's something lower, then they're going to put an offer on the table that reflects what they believe that is once they gather or receive all the information from the medical records, the bills, and the evidence of the case. So when you got three or four different companies, again, insurance companies and lawyers receiving that information, trying to evaluate all the clients involved, what are their exposures, that's when things could become a little difficult. In particular, they're going to oftentimes, you see kind of the smaller policy limits on these cases. So the insurance companies have to do what's called a pro rata split, right? Where they prorate how much, because let's say an insurance company was responsible for injuring three different vehicles, right? And they only have a $25,000 policy limit, but three different individuals were injured. Well, that insurance company does not have to pay more than 25,000 on that liability policy. Well, how do you split it up between those three people? Right? Who gets what? What's the most equitable way? And then you have the lawyers, and all the lawyers are trying to advance their client's interest to receive the most out of that. So those are the different type of issues that you don't see in single car type incidents that you see in multi vehicle incidents that makes things a lot more challenging.
Yeah, I can imagine. And what leeway do you have as an attorney if the insurance company comes back with a number that you feel is too low? Like what do you have to be able to do with that?
That's a kind of an open-ended question. It varies. Oftentimes, knowing the other injured parties, what their injuries were, could help kind of negotiate and maybe find some additional leverage. If your client has additional insurance, known as underinsured motorist coverage, which protects you in situations like this where your insurance company will kick in on top of what they have because they don't have enough coverage to take care of the full range of your damages. That's another avenue that can help in negotiations. Whether or not your client has a permanent injury, and maybe if some of the other people involved maybe have more of a soft tissue injury, strain, or sprain, that could also act as leverage to try to get more of that pot, understanding that they also have a equal right to some of that pot, but that can move the needle when it comes to negotiating when there's a lot of different claimants going after one policy.
I see. And is there ever a time when, let's say, you can't agree and it goes to court, and the judge, at that point, does the judge just make a determination, or how does that work?
Yeah, so there's this thing called what we could file for the insurance company, an interpleader action, and that's pretty much where State Farm or Geico says, "Hey, we only have $25,000, or we have $50,000. Here you go, court. Go ahead and impart that, and you determine who gets what."
Okay. Well, that's good. That's an interesting thing to know. I don't think I've ever heard of that before, but
Yeah, so that's an
yeah.
option if everybody involved can't come to an agreement in a settlement where an interpleader action can be filed, where the court is going to go ahead and administer who gets what.
So let's talk a little bit more about compensation, because when you have multiple drivers involved in a crash, does each driver's liability affect the amount of compensation that you can seek for your client?
Yeah, absolutely. You may have one driver that has a $25,000 policy. You may have another driver, maybe it was a commercial vehicle, right? Maybe Cox or, Amazon caused the accident. They're going to have a lot more insurance coverage, right? So you're going to want to try to find a legal and ethical way to, see what exactly that vehicle is responsible for as far as your client's damages, right? And then you may have a couple that have a state minimal policy limit with respect to what they need to pay out. So, yeah, there's a lot of different moving parts when it comes to that. It's really kind of a fact-intensive analysis, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. It probably probably depends on, like you said, is it a company? Is it a person? All of those things factor into it. So I am curious to know, so you said you've been doing this for about a decade. Tell me about a success story. Tell me about a multi-vehicle accident that you had to handle and that you were able to get a favorable outcome for your client.
Yeah, so we had one that didn't resolve not too long ago. It wound up going to litigation here, but we were trying to do a pro rata share in pre-litigation, so before a lawsuit was filed, and I believe there was three different insurance companies involved. And what wound up happening was the officer had got it wrong. We requested a police report, read his narrative, and it was very nonsensical in terms of the narrative that he wrote of how the accident. It wasn't until luckily we didn't take the offers that were on the table because it just wasn't making sense to us and our client wasn't being made whole. So we wound up filing a lawsuit and actually exhausting the policy limit on two different insurance carriers. One had a $250,000 policy and another one had a $50,000 policy. But once we got into depositions and the entire story got to be fleshed out, the real story and, who impacted who and in what sequence came out, which really allowed us to, to settle for the full damages with respect to what was available for our client.
Yeah. So actually, this is really interesting. So talk to me about this for a minute. You just said that the police report was incorrect. Mm-hmm. What do you do in that case? The police are supposed to tell you the correct thing to do.
Yeah, they're human, right? Just like we're human. And sometimes humans get it wrong, right? None of us are going to be able to be exempted from that, right? At times. Sometimes they may be overworked, they're moving fast, or sometimes there's just typos, right? Oftentimes they always use vehicle 1, vehicle 2, vehicle 3, vehicle 4. So the more vehicles you have in these type of cases that we're talking about, the more risk there is to inadvertently put vehicle 3 when it should have said vehicle 2. That's something that we see a lot, right? And it's just like, wait a minute, we believe that they wanted to put this vehicle, but they didn't. And it just kind of creates a lot of confusion. And if that mistake or inadvertence helps the insurance company, sometimes they dig their foot into that, right? And now, that's how we wind up in court to try to really just see what happened, speaking to all the parties.
I see. So that's where you're going to go back and rely on the evidence that you've gathered, whether it's the dash cam footage, the eyewitness reports, or maybe other expert opinions, and you're going to kind of put together the story that way.
That's correct.
Well, Jared, it's been a pleasure talking to you and learning about this today. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
We appreciate you, John. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, and to our audience, thank you for tuning in to Behind the Neon Lights, Understanding Personal Injury Law in Las Vegas and Beyond with C. Jerry Clark. To connect with the team, head to injuryattorneyvegas.com. And if you liked what you heard, feel free to leave a like or subscribe or leave a review so we can get this in front of more people. And with that, I hope you have a great day, and we'll see you next time.
Awesome. Have a good one. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.